So over to you. Take it away, Anna. Oh, sorry. I would just kind of protocol for the evening. Forgot to mention that. So Anna, so if you want to speak for kind of 30 or 40 minutes, thereabouts, it's entirely up to you how long you want to speak for. And then we'll kind of use the last 20 minutes or so for discussion, question, and answer. Also, we've got the chat function. So if anybody feels the kind of urge to ask a question mid-presentation, so if you want to maybe put a question in the chat area, and then I can kind of revisit that and prompt Anna to maybe consider that question and answer later. So that hopefully that's the last interruption. So now over to you, Anna.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. I have got a bit of a presentation. It's really more to help me organise my thoughts more than anything else. It just take me a little minute. I know that's working. That's working perfectly, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, so thanks so much for having me, Craig, and thanks everyone for coming to the rescheduled event, because I know we had been aiming to do this before Christmas. I'm pleased to say I think you'll probably get a bit more out of me than you would have done the last week before I finished for Christmas. I've certainly had a bit more time to sort of sit with what I was going to say and stew on it a little bit. And I will try and keep to 30 or 40 minutes. I might go off on a massive tangent because I do that, particularly when talking about the sort of two areas of research that I'm going to talk about this evening. So as Craig says, I'm a programme and student lead with the University of Law. I've been with ULaw since September, but I have absolutely no background in law whatsoever. And I'm reluctant to some extent to claim any sort of background in education research anyway, because my research background originally was in English literature, and my PhD is in English and American Studies from the University of Manchester. We'll move us on a little bit. Sort of explain how we got where we are currently. My PhD research was on Holocaust narratives. It was on the development of Holocaust narrative as a genre in its own right, identifying the genre markers set down by survivor testimonies, looking at the psychological impact of survivor narratives for them as survivors and as authors, looking at cultural responses to those narratives, and then how that's been reconfigured in contemporary fictional accounts of the Holocaust, which is a lot in there. I had to get it out today to find a quote, and I was like, oh, this is good. This is, go me. There's a lot in there, and it's quite old for me now. I think I got my PhD in 2008. In fact, I know I did, because I have a story about my viva. I had my viva on the day that Barack Obama was elected. So I went off to Manchester and did my viva and passed my viva, and then came home and stayed up all night and watched the election results come in. And it was the best day ever. So very different though to, it's not really anything to do with education at all. I did, whilst doing my PhD, train as an A-level English teacher, and I taught English A-level for about a year before I got a post at UCLan, which was education related. So although I've taught A-level English, I've taught a little bit of undergraduate English literature, I've never held a post as a lecturer in English. My higher education roles have always been in education, and that was a shift that came about really while I was doing my PGCE. I sort of developed my interest in education as my second subject, I suppose I would describe it as. Since I started on the path of education research, I've always been very, very interested in identity anyway, and I think my research interest in identity I can sort of trace all the way back to my undergraduate English work, and my master's dissertation was on Angela Carter's fiction, and it was on, I'm trying to think of the title now, Theatrical Constructions of Gendered Space in the fiction of Angela Carter. So it was very much about the performance of identity and the performance of gendered identity in Angela Carter's work. So I've always been interested in identity, and very early on in my academic career, in HE, I was introduced to academic identity as a concept, and that's always really stuck with me and been an area of interest. And I think possibly because I've had a number of different academic roles and a number of different roles in education, and I've never really sat where I was supposed to sit. So I never really followed that path of doing your PhD in your subject and then going into teaching in that subject. I sort of took a very sort of veered off towards education. My early academic roles were in employability, and so in that role I was very much looking into curriculum development, curriculum design, embedding employability into curricula and looking at how the subject can work alongside something like employability. And people used to say to me, "Oh, you've got a PhD, didn't you want an academic career?" And I was sort of, my role at the time was lecturer. I was a lecturer and I held a PhD and I was actively researching, but because it wasn't I wasn't a lecturer in X subject, I wasn't a lecturer in English literature, I was seen as not being an academic, which I always thought was quite interesting in terms of that perception. Then later, sort of in my career, so 2015 onwards, I took another sideways step into academic development and sort of teaching and learning development more formally, and got involved with delivery of the PG Cert Learning and Teaching in HE at UCLan. And I ended up leading the HEA fellowship scheme at UCLan. So again, very much involved, so education as my primary subject, very much sitting on the peripheries of other people's academic journeys, and again holding the title of lecturer, senior lecturer in, but not being seen as an academic despite holding an academic title and being active in research. Methodologically speaking, over the last couple of years, I've developed an interest. I was introduced to autoethnography by my former manager, Sue Moron Garcia, who's very widely published in the field and who's sort of very well known in education, higher education circles. And autoethnography really spoke to me for reasons that I will discuss shortly. And drawing on some of my earlier work, my earlier research around Holocaust narrative, I started to sort of, my interest developed in visual autoethnography, and that is what I'm going to talk about, and that's sort of what we're here to discuss in this seminar. And so my most recent publication, autoethnographic publication, has been using visual autoethnography to explore my academic identity as an academic developer, and I'll say a little bit about that as well. So I said that I was going to talk about kind of where this has come from, and I wanted to touch on a little bit on my PhD research into Holocaust narrative, because a lot of the work that I did explore visual narrative or written narratives that have a visual aspect to them. And that was a really important part of the research that I did into Holocaust survivor testimony. And it's something that comes up again and again and again in survivor testimonies of the Holocaust, is this real emphasis on sight and seeing. This is a quote, the first quote from Ernst van Alphen. It's from a article about the visual, I think it's called Caught by Images, and it's about the visual imprint of Holocaust survivor testimony. And in this little quote, Van Alphen's talking about the privileged epistemological status of observation of the visual world, and how the visual and being able to claim eyewitness status is given this kind of privileged status as a guarantee of knowledge and understanding. And I find that quite interesting, really, because with survivor testimony, a lot of the time, what's being claimed as the truth of an experience isn't necessarily the historical record of what actually happened. And Dory Laub has a really good example of this in his book Testimony. which I'd thoroughly recommend. If you want an introduction to testimony as literary form, then Fellman and Laub's book Testimony 1992 is absolutely fantastic, and it touches on testimony in lots of different forms as well. But in that book, Laub gives the example of one of the Holocaust survivors who gave testimony to the Yale video archive of Holocaust survivor testimony. And this woman's talking about her eyewitness account of the Auschwitz uprising. And she talks about how she saw all 4 of the crematoria chimneys had been blown up. And the person that's recording the video questions her on this because the historical record shows that only 1 of the crematoria chimneys was destroyed in the Auschwitz uprising. But this survivor is adamant that she saw all 4 blown up. And Laub talks about how what she's testifying to there isn't the historical record of what happened, it's the truth of the experience as it happened for her. And he says that to an inmate of Auschwitz, in those conditions, those sort of never-ending conditions where your sort of very humanity is taken away from you, that act of uprising by prisoners in those conditions, seeing 1 chimney destroyed was as almost magical, as incomprehensible as seeing all 4. And so what she's testifying to isn't the historical record of the number of chimneys that were destroyed, it's the enormity of the act and what that meant to her. And Laub talks very much repeatedly throughout the book about testimony as being about getting to the truth of an event as it was experienced by that individual, rather than the historical truth of an event. And so if you go into kind of testimony from a psychoanalytical perspective, there's a lot in there about what do we actually mean by truth and what is the truth that we value and what truth are we trying to get to. And something else that I experienced through my PhD was this real butting of heads between historians and literature scholars about the use of Holocaust survivor testimony as a means of understanding the Holocaust, because it's not historically truthful, but it is true. It tells the truth of the experience. And so, as I later discovered when I started to move more into education research, there's a really strong phenomenological bent to Holocaust survivor testimony, which is very much about lived experience and trying to get to the truth, uncover the truth for that individual so that they can come to terms with it, and that's the psychoanalytic aspect of it. So with this real emphasis on seeing, witnessing, and building visual imprint into these narratives. And the second quote there is a quote from a Holocaust survivor called Charlotte Delbo, who wrote this absolutely phenomenal text, a series of texts that were then collated into one called Auschwitz and After. And that's I put a picture of Charlotte Delbo on the slide because she was a very important part of my PhD and my experience, my learning about those experiences. And her writing is so evocative. So historians don't like, I'm sorry for any historians present, that historians don't like it because it's so evocative and it's about evoking feeling and reaction and response rather than writing down this is exactly what happened. But this is a refrain from one of the poetic fragments in Auschwitz and After, where she's describing something that she's seen as in Auschwitz. And then she says at the end, try to look, just try to see. And she's really imploring the reader not just to read the words, but to see the images. And that's something that we see a lot in survivor testimony. It's very important, almost as the bearers of some sort of historical record, whether that's factual or the record of an experience. It's very important to not just tell a story, but paint a picture. And that's also what Van Alphen's talking about there. So something that came up a lot. I didn't do a lot with visual narratology and visual narrative in my PhD, but it was something that I came up against a lot. Then moving into academic identity as a concept, sort of a shift of research focus. A lot of this uncertainty, this identity work about uncertainty and sort of personal truth crops up again in a very, very different way, of course. My more recent research in academic identity has been about this kind of struggle over boundaries of authenticity, about being able to lay claim to a particular identity or not, or being able to name a space for that identity. A lot of the academics that I worked with, that I still work with, are what's called dual professionals. So they've been nurses or solicitors or doctors or engineers, and then they move into academia and they have a really hard time naming that space. Sort of, there's a quote, I think, by Fiona Smart and Daphne Loades possibly, about existing in the betwixt and between two identities, two professional selves. This idea that becoming an academic is not smooth or straightforward or linear, but it involves inauthenticity, marginalization and exclusion. A lot of the research I've done and the identity work that I've done with my own students has been about trying to kind of work through that inauthenticity and that marginalization. And that led me to using encouraging my own students who are academics to develop their own visual narratives to explain kind of how they're feeling at that moment of betwixt and betweenness, and sort of in those liminal spaces where they're not quite sure if they're still a fashion buyer or but they're not happy to name themselves as a fully fledged lecturer or an academic either. So I developed this is an exercise that I did quite a lot with my own students at UCLan, and it was I will say borrowed, straightforward, lifted from the work of Daphne Loades at Edinburgh. She published in 2010, I think, she published an article called "I'm a Dancer" or "I've Got a Saucepan on My Head," and it was about some activities that she'd done with nursing lecturers, I think at Teesside possibly, to help them work through that sense of sort of liminality, marginalization, try and sort of name that funny space between being a nurse and being a lecturer. And she got them to make collages about how they were feeling about their relationship to teaching, how they saw themselves as teachers and what teaching meant to them. And I loved that. It really spoke to me, and I think it spoke to me because of the visual element to it, and again trying to tell stories about self and experience in a really visual way. So that's something that I started doing with my own students very early on our PG cert. And this is an example which I do have permission to share. This is an example of a collage that was made by a group of students a few years ago on the theme of what teaching means to me. I mean, I won't say a lot about the activity because I've written about it elsewhere and I've talked about it elsewhere, and we're not here to talk about this activity as such, although I'm happy to have a chat about it later on. But again, it was a really useful insight for me into how visual images and visual metaphors really helped people to tell stories about their experiences. And what I found again and again and again with this activity is that you'd have a group of people who were all new to teaching, all experiencing to some degree or other this sense of kind of alienation from their professional selves, whether they'd come straight from PhD into teaching in an academic role, or whether they'd come from another professional background. They were all in these early stages of trying to work out who they are now that someone says you're a lecturer. What does that mean, and how do we identify with that? And you'd put them all in a room together, and you'd sort of do group work say, how are you feeling? What does teaching mean to you? What do you think the ideal teacher is? And you'd get some very sort of stock answers, some very superficial answers, or no answers at all. Put them into groups and ask them to do this activity, and suddenly you find people sharing things that actually they probably wouldn't share within their departments. So a good example is there is the in the bottom left hand corner of the collage, where someone's chosen an image that says, "Help, I can't make it on scraps alone." And someone else, there's theories on everything there. There's the Great Divide. You'd very often, it was very, very common that people would pull out these types of images that really depicted the way they were struggling with this new role, and have this sort of sense of imposter syndrome, being overwhelmed, not feeling like they could share that with colleagues in their own departments, but finding some common ground through the shared use of these images in the collage. It really gave people a platform to say things that they wouldn't say verbally, and they were happy to do so through the use of the images. And the image itself almost creates a filter then, so you can say, I've chosen this image because this image represents a sense of being overwhelmed, or a sense of, you know, here's a picture of someone who's underwater. It represents that sort of drowning feeling of being overworked and overwhelmed. And the image itself, like I say, it becomes a filter. So it's not an individual saying, I feel overwhelmed, but it's the image represents this feeling of being overwhelmed. And it became a really powerful tool for people to share those types of feelings without claiming them for themselves, without making themselves vulnerable in that way. And this was something that I observed through initially using the activity because it spoke to me for whatever reason. I then sort of discovered this power that the use of visual metaphor had for really allowing people to name experiences in a way that they felt safe with. And so this is something, again, keeping an eye on the time, this is something that I've developed into my own research into academic identity. And as an academic developer, it's something that comes up again and again. And Sue Moran Garcia, who was my head of department when I became an academic developer, she published about this in IJAD, in the International Journal for Academic Development, in 2015. She wrote a collaborative autoethnography with two other colleagues called The Chameleon on a Tartan Rug, to try and explore what it means to be an academic developer and how that identity is very liminal, and it does shift depending on sort of what role you play in your own university, how you feel you're perceived by your colleagues. And that academic, it is very much a sense of being a border crosser. And sort of Whitchurch uses the concept of a blended professional or a third space professional, because you're not fully a teacher, you're not fully a researcher, you're not fully an academic, even if you are. You're not fully professional services either, because very often academic developers are involved in teaching and research, and it's a funny old place to be. And so a lot of academic development research does deal with this question of identity and who on earth are we, what on earth are we doing. And so as I became more embedded into that role, my research definitely tended in that direction. And I was really, really interested, with my sort of past interest in identity and academic identity, I was really interested in this sort of question of academic developer identity and third space professional identity as well. And there's a lot in academic developer identity about this notion of being an insider or an outsider, because, you know, you're part of the academic community. Lots of my fellow academic developers have PhDs, they're actively publishing. I've been returned into the last two refs for English literature rather than for education, which I am trying to do something about, but not my choice. So you're in the ref, you're publishing, you're doing I'm here to doing research seminars, but you're not seen as an academic by other academics because you're not an academic in your original subject. It's a weird old place to be. And then particularly being involved in things like the HEA fellowship scheme, sometimes you're seen as an agent of management, and kind of one of them. And I very much have had some difficult conversations, some slightly choice emails from colleagues at times about things like professional development, HEA fellowships, a really difficult place to be. But as you've probably twigged by now, this whole notion of being an insider, being an outsider is something that really does lend itself to autoethnographic research. Given that ethnography itself is so much concerned with kind of the position of the researcher as an insider or an outsider. Which leads me eventually to visual autoethnography. So there has been some work done on visual autoethnography, although when I wrote my the paper that I'm talking about, I started this I think in 2018 or 2019. There wasn't a lot out there. There'd been some visual autoethnography done around tourism research, of people taking pictures of locations and then responding to them. And one, I think there was a paper that was sort of horticultural as well. It was about gardens, but there wasn't a lot of visual autoethnography out there. So it was something that I was looking at for myself, developing from this new interest that I'd developed in autoethnography as I'd been learning education research and learning about more about academic identity, more about academic developer identity, but also a throwback to my PhD research and some of the work that I'd engaged with around visual narratology in relation to the Holocaust in particular. So I won't say, I'm going to make a bit of an assumption that many people here will be familiar with autoethnography as a research method. Very qualitative, very reflexive, and very subjective in the sense of it's the researcher exploring his or her own experience with elements of autobiography, but the ethnographic element being analytical. And it's about getting to grips with a particular culture or a particular experience based on the researcher's own exposure to that culture or the experience within that phenomenon. So it has that phenomenological bent to it that I was also describing in relation to testimony. And it's very, very interested in the question of cultural insiders and cultural outsiders. And for that reason, it really suits the exploration of academic identity that academic developers undertake, I think, because so much of that experience is about being an insider or being an outsider, or feeling like you should be an insider, but being told you're an outsider. It sort of really, the autoethnographic account of that experience is very rich, and I think there's a lot of potential there. It's also very much congruent with a study framed by intersectionality. I'm not going to say a lot about intersectionality other than, again, it's a really interesting position to take, looking at, and obviously the origins of intersectionality are linked to critical race theory, and I don't want to kind of hijack intersectionality to talk about my experience as an academic developer, but there's a lot of intersecting identities going on in the world of academia anyway, and particularly when you're dealing with dual professionals, blended professionals. It's interesting to try and unpick what's happening at the intersections of those identities, and autoethnography is another, again, a really good tool for doing that. Move on quickly to visual narratology. So my go-to text on narratology at all is by Mieke Bal, and it's called Narratology. And there's a chapter in that book on visual narratology, which is very much Bal's take on visual narratology. It's different to the visual narrative that I was describing in Holocaust Testimonies, because that is about how words create a visual imprint, a visual picture. Visual narratology is about how an image tells a story without the use of words. So it's almost a complete 180 from what I was talking about earlier. But the two things kind of do sit side by side. There's a lot going on in Holocaust narratives. There's a lot of layers, and narratology is a really good tool for unpicking that, particularly in survivor testimony, where we're dealing with a truth that is not a historical truth but a personal truth. And when survivor testimony has a lot of unreliable narrators, because very often the narrator doesn't actually know the story that they're telling, they're kind of detached from it. There's a good example in that Ernst van Alphen article, and I won't give the example because it's quite horrific, but there is a example of a woman, different woman, testifying to something that she saw happening in the camps. She describes it, but she doesn't have an emotional response to it. And Van Alphen talks about how it's almost the image has been recorded mentally, but she hasn't processed it. And that's something that Dory Laub talks about in the testimony book, that the act of giving testimony enables the processing of that trauma so that it becomes real to the subject for the first time. So, I'm sorry, again, gone off on a little tangent there. Visual narratology then it's not about creating a visual image with narrative. It's the other way around. It's creating a narrative with visual images. And I've used the illustration of Gin Lane because that's a really famous example of a picture that very clearly tells a story. There's more going on. There's so much going on in this picture, and it's a very well-known picture, so I won't say lots about it. Visual narratology is really kind of about honing in on what is the narrative. So Mieke Bal talks about how when we see an image, we instantly interpret it and we know the story without telling ourselves, without narrating it to ourselves. The image is processed so quickly that we understand the story without consciously narrating it to ourselves. And that's something that's happening here in Gin Lane. It's something that happens with every sort of image we look at. With visual narratology, what we're trying to do to some extent is unpick that narrative, slow down and look at what's prompting that narrative. Where are we getting this from? What story is being told here and how is it being told? And I've taken with visual autoethnography, with my own research, what I've tried to do is take that process, slow it down, and use it autoethnographically as a prompt to explore my own experiences of academic identity through pictures that I have taken and shared. So I'll just give a couple of very, very quick examples because I've sort of used these in my own research anyway. So if you've seen the paper snapshots of selfhood, then you'll know these anyway, and I don't want to labour that point. It's the picture I took at a conference. I went to the CEDAR conference, lovely conference, the CEDAR conference, long time ago, in the olden times when we did face-to-face conferences. And I took a little picture of my conference badge because I was so proud that I had my CEDAR fellowship letters on it. And the reason I did this is because I got the CEDAR fellowship, I think I got in the summer of 2017, and I went to the CEDAR conference that summer, and I had to become a fellow of CEDAR, you have to do an online course. And I'd done the course and I knew that I'd passed the course, but it hadn't been to the external yet. So I knew that I was a fellow of CEDAR, but it wasn't official. So when I went in the summer of 2017, I didn't have the special letters on my badge, and I had a different coloured badge. I think the fellows get a different coloured badge. So when I went again the year after, I was so proud of my little self that I had my post-nominal CEDAR fellowship letters on my badge. I was so over the moon, and it meant a lot. it meant a lot to me because I'd wanted to do the Cedar Fellowship course in my previous role, and my department at the time had refused to fund it. And I'd been quite unhappy in my previous role as well. I sort of felt like I'd ended up being stuck in a bit of a rut and not really going anywhere. And that was just one example of how that had been manifested. So then when I moved into academic development and it became possible for me to do the course and get the fellowship, I was really, really pleased with myself. It felt at the time probably more of a big deal than it really was. But again, it's lived experience, isn't it? It's how you experience that phenomenon. And I very much did experience this as a really kind of momentous moment career-wise. So I took a picture of my badge and I put it on Twitter. Like, look at me. And then I've got some other examples that I'll click through. I've done this a few times. I catch myself doing it. And the prompt for the visual autoethnography paper was really, what story am I trying to tell here? Why am I doing this? What story am I trying to tell? And what is this telling me about my experience of my own academic identity at that moment? And I think what I arrived at was, it was very much about this kind of liminality and this betwixt and between space, and seeking validation for myself as an academic developer by sharing these images and hopefully getting sort of the recognition from other academic developers for doing so. So it was autoethnographically speaking, it was a really interesting exercise to sort of look at, what pictures am I taking? What are these pictures saying? Why am I doing this? What does this tell me about my own experience, but about the wider experience of academic developer identity? And bearing in mind what Mieke Bal says about interpretation, and when we see images, they've already been interpreted. What I have done with these images is I've really tried to dig into kind of the superficial meaning. What does this say? What is the picture? What does it depict? But then also the metaphorical meaning. So going back to the collage work that I was doing with my students, what's the visual metaphor here? How can I interpret this? And then what does that tell me autoethnographically about my own experience? So with this one, it's a close-up of the lanyard. I got a rainbow lanyard because I did the LGBT ally training at UCLan, and that was important to me. And then the leaf badge was because I did the Aurora Women's Leadership Program in 2018, and again, something I didn't feel was accessible to me previously that had become accessible to me. And so I thought about that, and I talked about that and what those things represent for me career-wise, but then also looking at kind of what's the metaphorical meaning of the rainbow, the leaves, and talking about this idea of, for me, this is a period of growth. It was a period of development. There's an upward trajectory on that lanyard if you read from left to right. So what does it represent? Not just literally in terms of what was going on for me at this moment, but metaphorically, how do I now read this and interpret it? Which sort of takes us full circle, really. And I'll wind up this bit in a minute because I have talked at length. I knew I would. Sorry, Craig. Takes us full circle, really, back to what I was saying about testimony and the sort of historical truth versus personal truth. What sort of truth are we looking for when we're trying to explore experience? Because one of the kind of arguments that I have back and forth with myself about this methodology is the interpretive nature of the method. So when I'm looking at a picture that I've taken, if sort of take, not that one because that was one taken of me, this lovely picture of Manchester in the sunshine, I know, rare event. I took this one because I was invited to Manchester Met to talk about the collage activity that I'd been doing. And I was really, really nervous, a bit starstruck because you know, some of the people that invited me, I was a huge fan of their work, and I was really kind of, I can't believe this is happening. And because I did my PhD in Manchester, and when, you know, I would never have thought, when I was going backwards and forwards on the train to Manchester and getting off at Oxford Road, living in Preston, because I was self-funded for my PhD. Long story, lots of politics, not going to go into that. That I would have, you know, be coming back to Manchester, getting on the train and going to Manchester to tell someone about my work in education, would never have thought. So I was really, you know, lots of feelings, very overwhelmed. When I went back to this, I was really struck by kind of like the juxtaposition of old and new there. Good old Oxford Road station, with the building, there's a very, very shiny tower block in the background that wasn't there when I was doing my PhD. I don't think anything that's around Oxford Road station was there when I was doing my PhD, apart from the Hotspur Press, which I hope will be there forever. And sort of that was, when I took the picture, I wasn't thinking necessarily about that juxtaposition of old and new, but when I went back to it to do that autoethnographic analysis, it was definitely something that stood out to me. And it does raise the questions, I think, about interpretation and about what interpretations the researcher imposes on the images that may or may not have been there at the time of capture. If I go back, this one's slightly different because I didn't take this picture. I didn't even know that picture was being taken. That's me, in case you can't tell. In full flow at a conference. It was taken by the conference photographer. And you know, sometimes if you've presented, you can buy you can have one picture for free from the official camera roll afterwards. This was my picture, and I really like it because I look like I know what I'm doing. I'm like, I think I'm answering a question. I've got my pen in my hand, and I'm like, yes, I'm making a really good point here. So I didn't take this picture. I've got no idea what the photographer was thinking when they took it, apparently by peeking through the door, because I didn't even know there was a photographer there. So when I analyze this and when I've written about this picture, I'm very much putting my own interpretation on it and its meaning. And so it's got a meaning for me that it doesn't have for the person who took the picture. Whereas the other pictures that I've talked about, I took those pictures, so I kind of know what I was thinking when I took them. But then I'm also imposing a different interpretation on them when I use them autoethnographically. And so I think that's something that I've been kind of puzzling with and working through in terms of this particular method, autoethnographically speaking. And it was definitely something that I got comments on from reviewers when I've put papers in for publication using the methodology, is kind of, how do you reconcile this interpretation, or the way in which the images are being interpreted, which might be different to the intention of the photographer, whether the photographer is myself or not. So that's one of the challenges. It's quite exposing, as well as autoethnography always is. And there's that question of interpretation and subjective interpretation of those images. So that's sort of my whistle-stop tour around visual autoethnography as a research method and how I personally came to it. And I think it's interesting. I do find it interesting that I've ended up back at this question of what, when we say we're looking to get to learn about an experience, what are we looking for? Are we looking for historical truth, or are we looking for subjective truth? Are we looking for the individual's personal version of that experience, or are we looking for something more reliable in inverted commas? So sort of questions for discussion, really, if we've got time for a bit of a chat. I'm wondering, I've not done a lot, autoethnographically speaking, of traditional autoethnography in terms of kind of responding to a reflective journal or anything like that. You know, my autoethnography has so is that level, that layer of interpretation or filtration that I'm talking about, is it greater in visual autoethnography than in other forms of autoethnography, or is it something that's always there to some extent? And is that actually a problem? Or if we acknowledge the researcher's own filtering of that account of that experience through the autoethnographic lens, does it become part of the experience or the representation or the interpretation of that experience? Is it actually a problem, or does it enrich the account? I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'll stop sharing as well.
There we go. I couldn't find my unmute button there for a second. Brilliant. Thanks. Thanks, Anna. There's a couple of questions that have popped up on the chat function from Anne-Marie. So I also have a question,
Yep.
but I'm not going to kind of abuse my position as chair and kind of leap in.
Oh.
So I'll invite Anne-Marie, because I think she's posted both the questions, if she wants to maybe ask you the questions.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much. I think what I really want to do is go and have a coffee with you and just have a really good chat for several hours. So maybe that's for another time, because so much of what you talked about resonated around the insider-outsider identity, and the non elements as well are the things that I'm really interested in. And I'm really interested in autoethnography and have kind of dabbled in it, but not in any publication. And I've always, I don't know if it's a struggle, but this idea that autoethnography has to come, well, I'm thinking of Tony Adams and Arthur Bochner and people like that, who talk about the lens of culture has to be at the sort of forefront of autoethnography, which is I find difficult, because it is so subjective. It is such a subjective place, isn't it? Where does the cultural lens sort of, or how does it shape the autoethnography? I don't really know what my question is, in a sense, but it's sitting there as you were talking. I was saying, is it a sort of the culture of being in academia that is a lens, or is it your personal culture that you've filtered it through? I guess that's behind my question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a great question, and I don't know if I know the answer to that, because it is so subjective. Is it something, I suppose it's something that you'd have to work really hard to be aware of as well, isn't it? I think certainly I feel like, so my gut feeling is that the work that I've done is kind of situated within and a response to the culture of academia. Is it also influenced though by, like I say, my own research culture? I think honestly, hand on heart, I'm drawn to autoethnography because my experience of research, I'm half thinking I might ask Craig to stop recording this. My experience of research up until the point of moving into education research was very solitary, very kind of read books, have thoughts, write the thoughts down, hope that you get a PhD out of it. And having to then, I do struggle with collaborative research, and I try my best, and I have managed to do some collaborative research, but also kind of ethics and ethical approvals and things like that were completely new to me, because all my research in English literature, your subjects are books and authors, and it's not something you really have to worry about, even though, I was challenged on the ethics of writing about the Holocaust because I'm not Jewish, and that's a bit of a non-question really, because the Holocaust isn't an entirely Jewish event, but understanding the cultural meaning for Jewish people, I was challenged on that by other students, but not by the university. And it's not really the sort of thing that I'd need to go through ethical approval anyway. So I think, I'm drawn to autoethnography because it's me and my own thoughts a lot of the time, and it's back to me and my books, and it's a solitary pursuit. And I think, so am I coming at it through the lens of my own experiences of research in literature? And I really struggle to sort of make any sorts of claims to be an education researcher, I think, for that reason.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. I think Anne-Marie's asked another question, but yeah. Damien has kind of waved a hand. So if I can just bring Damien in at this point.
Well, yeah, thanks very much, Anna. That certainly a lot of what you said resonated with me, because I spent a lot of time in academic and language development and support, and moving in between different departments and different colleagues and things. Sometimes I felt that the expectations that each place that was put on you was quite difficult to navigate around. I often felt that sometimes I was the some part of what people thought I wasn't, rather than what I could be or what I could offer. And I think it's really interesting, the idea of kind of self-affirmation and validation through the self-ethnography. So, I mean, that really resonates. Thanks. And I think that's something I'm doing an ED at the moment as well, and I'm going through these changes in identity and stuff. So I think that has been really, really useful for me. It's a different way to maybe think about what I'm doing. And it all goes to Heidegger about this bit about being as well. What you know, it's where am I going? I'm in this process, but I don't know where I'm going, and I don't know what's happening to me, kind of thing. So I think that was very, very interesting and very, very useful. But I just wanted to ask you about this idea of the extent to which, when we have our roles, how we kind of navigate those different ideas through this, and how this can possibly help with that. You know, if people do have an expectation of you, but your idea of what you're doing is very, very different.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something in the stories that we tell ourselves. I'm going to go back to the question of narrative. I think what's interesting, or an interesting area to look at, is being able to narrate your identity to yourself. And certainly I think that autoethnography helps to do that. It's autobiography with the added analytical lens, isn't it? So yeah, I learned, I mean, I think I really learned from doing that visual autoethnography work. I realized how much I look for affirmation from other academic development professionals, and I realized the extent of the value of the community of academic developers that I am part of, that is that you have to, for that particular role, you very often have to look for community outside your own institution. And these were all things that I really realized by looking at the way I was narrating my identity to myself through the use of these pictures.
Well, thank you. And this has been quite affirming for me, so thank you for that.
Lovely, good.
Yeah, it is good, because obviously I have a bias as well, because autoethnography, I think, is a fantastic mechanism for the reasons that Anna's identified. It is sort of intensely reflexive and personal. Anyway, so Angie Daly has raised a hand. So Angie, have you got a question?
Yeah, just thank you, Anna. Nice to hear, you know, the work as it's developed. And just, I think any type of work like this will always bring resonances in different people. So your question about the level of interpretation and filtration, greater in visual methods, and is that a problem, really takes me to Paulo Freire and Margaret Ledworth's work, you might know from Lancaster, where the use of images to unearth a critical analysis of the socioeconomic conditions. Like you said, those images can be distant, but they can start the development of research into problems, into naming the world, and also lead into action. So it's very much part of that Freirean praxis body of work in community development, the visual. And in a way, I've been trying to use a little bit of that, tiny bit of that in the EdD. Very, not quite as professionally as you, but Damien will remember when we drew each other. Last week, we were talking about research design and ethics. So on the basis of looking at sort of virtues and ethics, Bruce McFarlane's work, we collectively visualized ethical, what is a good researcher, what does a researcher look like? And there were collective drawings of that, and some of them were highly abstract and others were very, very figurative. And every time I hear you talk, in our joint module with Craig, I always think I need to finish that autoethnographic paper, Research Design Story, which I started in John Moore's in my first Sarah seminar in 2013. But actually, from a community worker, these kind of practices are really important, these kind of visual. So the level of interpretation and filtration, is it greater in visual methods? I think it does unearth knowledges and perspectives that are hard to access. And and particularly in a collective, I think that's really important. And I know you're working individually. Is that a problem? Like everything, it's always then collective, it's always around balance and different interpretations. And I think that's been really quite powerful in community work, community education, non-formal, as we talk about Craig and my module. So I was just kind of responding to your prompts really rather than a question. But I can see that even as part of that, there's a safe space for an individual to be visual in their mind and maybe not also reveal everything, but maybe contribute visually in a way, going back to your collage, in a way that they might not otherwise. So it's made me think a lot about that. So I don't think it's a problem. I just think it's about being mindful of the status and how people feel as well afterwards.
And I suppose to some extent it's another autoethnographic prompt, because you might want to ask yourself, why am I interpreting? Why am I formulating these interpretations, or why am I putting this particular lens on this image? If you want to go that deep into it.
Or why are we? Because I would always do it as a collective thing. Yeah. Thank you. I'll leave it there because I know Craig has a question.
We're kind of almost at time. So if any colleagues need to kind of disappear, I understand, but I do want to ask my question. And so, I mean, it links in largely to what has already been discussed, but so with autoethnography, because it's very much associated with freedom and creativity and reflexive expression, one thing that I'm interested in relation to autoethnography is trying to get students as kind of collaborators involved in and with autoethnography. So in kind of your experience, are there obstacles to inviting students to engage with and participate in visual autoethnography?
I mean, my experience has been quite limited on doing this with undergraduates. I think the only undergraduates I've tried this with are yours, Craig.
All right.
So it's, and I remember I had the very great honour of coming to Liverpool to do that class pre-pandemic, very, very shortly pre-pandemic, wasn't it? I think the end of February 2020. And I that was a really good experience for me, because I think the students did run with it quite well. And obviously you'll have seen them afterwards and you can tell me if they thought it was a load of rubbish. So it's not something I've really tried with undergraduates. My students have always been postgraduates and they've been other academics. And it's varied, to be honest. I think there are some very rigid ideas out there in the world about what research is. and I'm sure you'll all have come across this, and some people are more open-minded to the idea of even qualitative research as being a possibility. So very often in my previous role, we'd have a lot of people from nursing and a lot of people from medicine in those groups, and so to convince someone from a very scientific background that who have no research experience of their own, I should say, to convince someone from that background that they could be the subject of their own research, or their something that they've created could be the subject of their own research. It requires a massive leap of faith on their part, because they've been schooled in the importance of massive quantitative double, triple blind trials. But even, you know, so there would always be some that were very, very resistant to the idea, and then there would be some that really embraced it, and it was really transformational for some. Yeah. I think because it gave them the opportunity to see themselves as researchers first and foremost, see themselves as the subject of their own research, and just, I would say to some extent, validate their experiences and say this is worthy of being the subject of this research. Very mixed responses though. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I can give you the feedback from the students that when you can speak to them, and they found it incredibly rewarding and fulfilling and very different. Well, you know, which is, you know, that's why I'm interested in kind of trying to continue to develop this, because I think there's a lot of, you know, you've spoken about intersectionality and reflexivity, and there's so much of it. You know, the kind of challenges are kind of, and I know that Angie can kind of relate to this as well. The challenges come when, you know, in relation to the notion of objectivity, if somebody's given an intensely personal story and given a kind of a conceptual kind of interpretation on that, if it's their experience, who can say it's inaccurate or wrong? And you know, so that is a challenge, but I think it's one certainly worthy. It's a challenge worth rising to. And I'm sure you've seen some of those images and things that, you know, people produced and afterwards as well. And I'd say, Craig, we were blown away by, let's say, in a way where people could really, really demonstrate their understanding in a completely and utterly different way to a formal academic, yet was full of academic rigor. And it started with a self image or a set of images. And I think that's why that module is so powerful, because it allows people to, at that point, to really, really explore ideas. So it was a great catalyst, and yeah, I'm sure we'll get you back. Well, I mean, it's unfortunate that module hasn't actually run this year, but you rest assured that when it does run again, because it will, you know, you'll be invited back, Anna. So anyway, on that note, so I'd just like to thank Anna for the great presentation and really kind of, you know, respond to the questions so authoritatively and informatively. So many thanks for speaking, and thanks colleagues for coming along and supporting. And yeah, so we'll call it an evening. So thanks again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.